This presentation introduces the Malo Collective as an example of radical care in Nepal. As members of the collective, we offer some glimpses of our process in creating mutual aid initiatives over the past year. We argue that our work of digitally mediated transnational collaboration encapsulates and extends the understanding and praxis of radical care. Our aim for this conference is also to extend our own understandings of ways to envision, theorize, analyze, and contribute to producing social change. We begin first with a brief introduction to Nepal, a country of over 120 languages and ethnic groups.
Nepal's history of oppression can be discussed starting from Mulike in 1854, affirming the superiority of Hindus' ideology and their worldviews. The first national codified law based on the principles of the Hindu religious text, Manusmriti, institutionalized by the Prime Minister Jung Bahadur Rana, in turn created conditions for anti-Dalits and anti-indigenous. Following this particular system, different communities were hierarchically divided into four varnas or caste groups: Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra. Brahmins are placed at the top of the hierarchy, followed by the warrior caste group Kshatriya, followed by the merchant caste group Vaishya, and at last by Shudra. Certain indigenous groups were further divided into enslavable alcohol drinkers groups and non-enslavable alcohol drinker groups. This labeling and categorization were crucial in the nation-building process, as national policies and resources were operationalized and distributed accordingly, largely shaping not only how the ruling Hindu caste group dominated every visible spaces and available resources, but also how the oppressed communities survived and manufactured their present and futures. For instance, formal education was reserved for Brahmins, but not for Dalits and indigenous peoples, at least till the mid of the 20th century. Kshatriyas, designated as warriors, were recruited as chiefs of armies protecting the state. On the other hand, such a pattern of systematic violence, facilitated by Bahanwad, the Hindu caste hegemony, also impacted the indigenous lands, creating different markers and disposition of indigenous peoples and landlessness among Dalits. Certain groups of indigenous people that were deemed fit for the nation building project were only recognized and recruited as mercenaries, benefiting both the Nepal's colonial project and British imperial project in India during the late 1800s. Many groups were either left out or the state miserably failed to recognize their community names and distinct experiences. This was also the moment when the state engineered the isolation and division of the oppressed groups, destroying any possibilities of indigenous resistance and solidarity with other oppressed groups like Dalits. As argued by Ambedkar, now this system was not only the division of labor but also the division of laborers. Amidst these social and political challenges, Dalits and indigenous solidarities were imagined and practiced, and no doubt can be found in multiple social and political articulations and deliberations, transforming the Hindu monarchy nation to the Federal Democratic Republic secular state. These different orientations and understandings of relation making were also crucial in the decade-long civil war from 1996 to 2006, imagining the communist and socialist world. Almost 14 years since the declaration of Nepal being free from caste-based discrimination in 2006, people from so-called lower castes are still facing gruesome discrimination and are deprived of basic facilities and infrastructures. The pandemic has largely contributed to the creation of violent conditions affecting Dalits and indigenous peoples. In addition, as per the report prepared by the journalist Ashok Darnal, 753 cases of caste-related violence such as rape, murder, violence, and abuse were committed against Dalits during the first 5 months of the lockdown in Nepal. At the time of the pandemic, Nepal's army was also involved in the killings of Rajkumar Chepang, the indigenous boy. The army was also involved in the re-territorialization of indigenous land and associated land disputes involving the fast-track development, largely affecting the indigenous Newar communities situated in Kokana. This continuation of caste violence and domination also transformed the understandings and practices of indigenous activism on the ground. Thanks to Malo Collective, oppressed groups such as Dalits and indigenous peoples created a new platform to renew their social, political, and economic relations, imagining and creating possibilities to analyze the caste systems.
Early in 2020, a few cases of caste atrocities garnered tremendous attention from the national media in Nepal, particularly the killing of Navaraj Biswakarma for wanting to marry a girl of the so-called higher caste. During the same time, and even before this incident, many atrocities against Dalit people have occurred. the conditions for which were exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, which didn't receive media attention or any form of public or material support. And even if they did, they were seen as isolated events instead of systemic ones. Hatimalu Collective, in response, collaborated with local organizers and activists in Nepal to launch 4 mutual aids for the Dalit and indigenous families who lost their loved ones to caste based violence. Most recently, we launched a mutual aid for the family of Guru Saran Sada, a dear friend, activist, and organizer for the Musahar Dalit community who died due to COVID, but also due to the health infrastructures that have been historically inaccessible to Dalits and other marginalized people. These mutual aids were started to create material conditions of survival for our fellow Dalit and indigenous folks who continue to be violated and killed by the marriage of the Hindu caste system, the state, and health institutions. I also wanted to highlight the Hatemalo festival that was organized in March 2021 to bring together the work from artists, poets, musicians, scholars, and activists from Dalit and indigenous communities living in Nepal and beyond its nation state borders. It served as a space to amplify the mutual aids that I mentioned earlier, and also became the space that our communities could go back to and find collective validation of our experience in a system built to alienate us. We started both the mutual aids and the festival with a very stark and collective realization that we cannot rely on the state for survival and justice. We are continuing to witness the death of Dalit folks just because they weren't able to access health services. And hence, organizing these initiatives have been survival work for us in the sense that it not only means being able to stay alive, but also being able to preserve and imagine futures that we could collectively work towards because we have been historically oppressed by the same system and in different ways. These initiatives have been spaces for building those relations among Dalit groups and different indigenous groups and to imagine caste annihilated futures together.
The impact of the caste system mentioned earlier is key to understanding the transnational dimension in Hatimalo Collective's mobilization. Due to common histories of struggle and oppression, campaigning for the mutual aid initiatives went beyond the nation-state of Nepal and even beyond its recent diasporas. It also included Bhutanese refugees and Indians from various ethnic backgrounds. Artists, organizers, and supporters involved came from different places of origin and were located around the world from both the global north and south. Such a form of transnational networking was sparked during the devastating 2015 Nepal earthquakes that gained media attention from around the world. However, the radical care we are practicing is different to disaster relief, which is now again taking place for urgent COVID-19 responses in South Asia. Cases of transnational activism have often been studied in terms of diasporas dealing with homeland politics or labor migrants in building communities through direct remittance. This is particularly the case in Nepal, where remittance makes up over a quarter of the national GDP. Despite continually receiving international foreign aid, often attached to regional geopolitical interests between India and China, unequal distribution of resources have driven a huge scale of citizens to seek employment and support outside their country. When the global COVID-19 pandemic struck, social media platforms and digital technologies provided new affordances to envision alternative modes of communication. The wave of Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 inspired communities around the world to examine their own systems of inequality, recruiting greater numbers to engage in forms of building awareness and activism through the Internet in creative ways and scales not seen before. The Hatimalo Collective conducted regular meetings through Zoom to plan for mutual aid initiatives and reached out to speakers and academics from South Asian Himalayan regions for a series of online discussions on the caste system. Those in Nepal created links with grassroots organizations and reached out to friends abroad to pool resources. members based in Nepal, India, the United Kingdom, United States, Canada, and Hong Kong recruited artists and academics from those places as well as the Netherlands and Australia. Some were famous nationally in Nepal, but most were not. Instead, they were picked for being significant in their own Dalit and indigenous communities. The mutual aid projects were picked with the aim to work on manageable and sustainable scales, given that organizing members were spread around the world.
To conclude, we want to reflect critically on our mutual aid initiatives and collaborative work. We are aware that our mutual aid initiatives cannot replace larger organizations working on larger scales, openly contesting the same struggles of settler colonialism and Brahmanism that we fight against. One of the points that we want to highlight is how people are moved into action only when there's a shocking event. We have launched one mutual aid for an arts center, but unfortunately that has not seen as much engagement as our other initiatives related to significantly traumatic and violent incidents. So we ask how mutual aid groups can engage in solidarity for initiatives that are not born out of visible violence. Another reflection to put forward is the political question of reliance on the legal system. We are supporting a legal case for one Dalit family, but we are also very cognizant of the irony and contradiction that we are relying on the justice system of the same state that has and continues to kill Dalit and indigenous peoples. There are these tensions and concerns that we would like to reflect on as we move forward.